I want to welcome everybody to February's risk reduction class, and we'll get started in a minute. I want to make a couple of opening comments about the material that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about things that mistakes that agents make that often lead to claims and problems after close of escrow. So I wanted to touch on those, and I want to start by saying in many ways, I'm preaching to the choir. As I look out at all your faces, you're consistently here every month. You've heard this message multiple times, some of you for many years. And I know that. I know I'm telling a lot of you what you already know. As many of you know, one of my favorite expressions, I have a handful, but the best learning happens when you're taught something you already know. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the fact that you probably know most of this. Uh, for some, however, maybe not so much. Some of you may not be aware of this. Maybe you're a little less experienced, a little newer to real estate. And so some of the things I'm going to share with you might be ahas. And the good news is you practice these and you will have less problems after close of escrow. And like the message that Lindsay sent out this morning, you get to keep more of your commission if you don't have to write checks to make problems go away. So my first goal is to help those that may not know this stuff. I want to make sure everybody has a pretty strong foundation in what this what some of these things that you can do to minimize claims after close of escrow. And interestingly enough, I take notes, as all of you know. I've been doing this for many years. Larry's been doing this. I think Diane has probably also been doing this in the company she was with. And if I checked with her, she would probably agree that I have identified perhaps the top 6 areas where I am seeing most of the claims, believe it or not, in after close of escrow issues. So helping those of you that may not be familiar with all of this, that's goal one. Goal two is to remind those of you who are familiar with this to be ever so diligent, never to slip up, never to let things slide. To do some of the things I'm going to say, but maybe sometimes you get in a rush. And I understand it's very tough listing and selling today. And your focus is on, finding buyers, helping buyers buy, finding sellers, helping sellers sell. And sometimes some of the details of executing a perfect transaction slip by just a little bit. And then after the fact, you say, oh, yeah, I know, I should have done that. I didn't. So this is to remind some of you about those things. So basically, like I said, I've identified 6 things that if practiced in every transaction would eliminate, and this number may sound like I pulled it out of the sky, but I actually did. I looked through my notes. I looked at all of our claims. More than 90% of the claims I deal with would be eliminated if the things I'm going to talk about today were perfectly practiced. So, that's our goal to try to reach perfection when it comes to risk management. And your clients are well served by doing that. So let's jump right into the presentation. If I can do this right, I think I can. I'm going to share my screen. And I think all of you can probably see my screen now, hopefully. Pull up my PowerPoint. And here we go. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Yes? No?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. All right. So as I start out every presentation, just to remind you, if you're working, I think I should be available. I may not be around, what is it, 24/7 or 7/24? I don't know, whatever order I'm supposed to be in. But I do make it a point to be available if you're, doing real estate, which, I recognize happens almost every day. I do take a little bit of time off, but I'm not far from the phone. During business hours, calling my direct line is by far the best way to reach me. I don't do business on my cell phone during business hours, and not that I don't want to. Well, maybe it is true I don't want to. It's just that it's so difficult for me to do the things I do all day long with my cell phone. So I use my landline. There it is. Of course, you can always email me if you need to. And evenings and weekends, if you text my cell. I don't keep the ringer on. Many of you know my wife. I don't want to disturb her. She sleeps whenever she can. And she's had she had a heart attack, and most of you know that. And so she's recovering very nicely. That's good. But I kind of, in deference to her, do not keep the ringer on. But the phone is never out of my sight. And the good news is it lights up, and I notice it. So text me evenings and weekends. I'm happy to respond to you. All right. The most common mistakes agents make that can lead to a claim or a litigation. Or another way to say that is, if you practice the things I'm going to talk about, you're going to minimize the claims that a buyer, mostly buyers, sometimes sellers, but mostly buyers make. And sometimes, if not eliminate litigation, at least position yourself to be able to defend the litigation quite well. So let's go into these 6 things. There are 6 of them. So the first one, this might be the most common one. That's why it's number 1. Failing to review the physical inspection report with the buyer and then recommending additional inspections. I can't tell you how important that is, that when you get the physical inspection report, you should call the buyer and say, after you've taken a look at it, so you sort of familiarize yourself with it, call the buyer up and say, listen, I want to walk you through this report for a little bit, and the buyer's going to wave you off. I'm kind of busy right now. I'll read it later. I understand, but I just want to kind of highlight a few things. If you can do that, and then later we can reference that you did that, we being the folks that are charged with defending you, starts with me, and it goes all the way up to the attorneys that we hire to defend us when the claims get serious. If we can say, and document that you've done this with the buyer, you reviewed the physical inspection report with the buyer, that helps a great deal. So that's number 1. And here's what you should keep in mind. The buyer agent has a fiduciary duty to the buyer that requires the agent to review the physical inspection report. Part of your fiduciary duty is to provide advice. And that's where reviewing this report is important, because courts are going to look at the buyer as being a novice, even if they're not. And the fact that you're being paid to represent the buyer, that representation, a fiduciary duty goes with that. And so you have to put the buyer's interest foremost in your mind, and that is to advise the buyer on things they may not be aware of, even though it's kind of common sense. The courts are going to look at buyers as if they don't have a clue on what they should do, and they're going to see if the agent stepped in and guided the buyer. So this is very important. Encourage the buyer to review the report with the inspector as well. After you looked at the report, you have any questions about the report, then by all means, let's get a hold of the inspector and ask the inspector those questions. And this should be done in writing. You should, in writing, encourage the buyer to go through the report carefully and to review the report with the inspector if they have questions. I can tell you, it's amazing to me, on more than a handful of situations, the buyer has not read the physical inspection report. That may be incredulous, but I have helped resolve problems on transactions where the property was $1 million or more. They paid $700 and $800 for an inspection report. And when I pointed out to the buyer on page 29, right there, the inspector told you about this, they confessed to me, especially when they're our client, well, I didn't have a chance to read it. So that's this little bit of advice, very, very important. Now, when you review the inspection report, or if the buyer's not going to get an inspection report, for inspections not done, you want to use a buyer inspection waiver, a BIW. Now, whenever the buyer chooses to waive a professional physical inspection, no, my dad's a contractor, Walt, he's going to take a look at the property. Okay, not a problem. If you're fortunate you have a dad who's available to help you, and if he's a contractor, all the better. However, if he's not a licensed inspector, or if he's not a professional inspector, I need you to waive the professional inspection report. So that's key. Every once in a while, somebody will say, oh, no, we had a physical inspection. My uncle looked at the property. Well, it turns out uncle was a drywall contractor, doesn't know anything about plumbing. So the so-called report, by the way, they never generate a report, which doesn't help us. I can tell you that these reports are very helpful when claims are filed later. Like I referenced earlier, I can sometimes see in a report where something was disclosed to the buyer, and therefore sort of minimizes the liability of the seller if we represent the seller, or the buyer's agent if we represent the buyer. So if they waive a professional home inspection, you want the BIW. If they waive the termite inspection, this is an area that I think is not practiced very often. So no termite is in the transaction, right? No, I don't want to do a termite. No, I want a clean offer. No, today's market. No, it's okay. You want to waive the termite inspection. And that's going to bite you if you don't make that a practice, because there's going to be a testimony that it is standard to have a home inspected, even though today a lot more inspections are waived, inspected by a termite company. So even though a lot of times these currently buyers aren't doing that as much, you want to waive it if they're not doing it. Use the BIW. You'll see in a minute where you can do that. Okay. Waive inspections asked for in the BMI. So the BMI, that most of you are familiar with that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. The BMI, the buyer tells you what their concerns are going into the transaction. This is not a substitute for a repair request. A BMI should be done before the physical inspection, because you want the buyer to tell you some of their concerns. You don't want the BMI to be a reflection of what they read in the physical inspection. And so sometimes, for example, they might say, yeah, I'm a little bit concerned about asbestos. I had a cousin who developed asbestosis, and I want to make sure the house doesn't have asbestos. So that's sort of then implying that you may have to do an asbestos investigation. So in the transaction, you talk to the buyer about arranging for that, and then the buyer finds out, oh my gosh, I got to pay for that? It's going to cost $700? Oh no, forget it. Well, then you want to waive that because it's on the BMI. So, you have the satisfaction of investigation, which is a generic form. If you're not familiar with that, get a hold of me, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it. But you also want to use the BIW to waive an inspection that the BMI sort of implied the buyer wanted. And then finally, to waive any recommended additional inspections, most commonly the physical inspection. Sometimes the termite inspection will recommend additional inspections. And so you'll want to do that. You'll take a look in a moment what that looks like. So you're all familiar with the BIW. So of course it talks about the importance of investigating the property, and it discusses that the buyer should conduct investigations and hire professionals to do that. It also talks about a general home inspection does not necessarily cover everything in the property. That's why the inspectors write on their reports, recommend a licensed roofer, recommend a licensed plumber, recommend electrician, all those different things. And some of them put that in their boilerplate practically. But if any professional recommends additional inspections, then the buyer is advised that they should get those additional inspections. So the waivers, the first one is the home inspection waiver. You're all familiar with that. So the buyer would initial that if he's going to waive that. There's the wood destroying pest inspection, the so-called termite inspection. If you're not getting a termite inspection, this should be part of your transaction. And then other inspections that the broker, you, the agent, might recommend to the buyer. This might be where you put the inspections that the buyer sort of implied as a result of the BMI, the buyer's material issues. So you would list those. So these three, A, B, C, are inspections the broker recommends. Okay. Now the next paragraph 4, are waivers of additional inspections recommended by other reports. So the home inspection, that's the most common one, prepared by who, dated when. They make recommendations, and you should get those investigations. And if you don't, you're acting against our advice. So the general home inspection, you check that one. Or if the wood destroying pest recommends a roofing inspection, sometimes I see that, then you should have them waive that if they're not going to get a roof inspection, or any other inspection that the buyer got that recommended some other inspection. Then that should be referenced there. Okay. Now, sometimes it's good idea to when let me go back. When the home inspection recommends inspections, this is sort of generic. It's sort of saying any inspections recommended by whatever box you check, the buyer should get. It's a good practice, and I talked to many of you about that, to itemize those items, to go through the physical inspection and list all of the inspections that the physical inspector listed. Now, you're going to have to prepare another list for that. And so you would attach a list to this waiver, general home inspection prepared by, and then you can say on the list, these are the inspections recommended by the home inspector, and recommend you get all of them. So list those, that's a good practice. You can also go back to 3C and fill that in. Okay, the broker is recommending, we're recommending, in addition to what the physical inspector recommended, that you get these additional inspections. So you can put those additional inspections down there. So the ideal is you're identifying specifically those inspections, but no, the form is designed to be somewhat generic, which is to your protection. So that's the good news there. Okay, we also have a very nice home inspection waiver in Agent Hub. It's a form that I wrote. I need to update it, I noticed, because the cost of inspections now is probably, I don't think you can get an inspection for $250, and they're probably getting up to about close to $1,000. So maybe I'll make a note, Lindsay will make a note to remind me to edit that just a little bit. And change those prices. But this is a nice form because it's written in sort of plain English. And it does talk about the fact that we're going to look at the property, and any red flags that we see, we'll point them out. But then it goes on to say, we may not see everything. We're only going to do a visual inspection. That's not as good as having everything else look at: soil, structural, roof, heating, air conditioning. We're not looking at any of that. And so you should hire an inspector to do a more thorough inspection. So this is a nice redundancy. Lindsay's not going to, send you an email and bug you if you don't have this form, if you have the car waiver. But if you do the car waiver and this form as well, the in-house form, you're doubly protected. So it's a nice extra practice to go a long way to helping you there. Okay. And then also the buyer's investment advisory, be sure you have that in your file. I think that's pretty straightforward. Again, the practice should be you review this with the buyer. They signed it initially with the offer. Right now, you're trying to get the offer accepted. You got all the terms of the offer. Hey, good news, your offer's accepted. Yay. Now I want to go through. It's time to get an inspection done. I want you to take a look at that buyer investigation advisory that you signed when you signed the offer. And then you walk them through that. Being able to document you've done this is tremendous. We have a pretty major claim right now, and their claim is they've signed everything. They signed waivers, they signed everything. So on paper, it looks clean. But the buyers are alleging that they just signed it because it was put in front of them. They are first-time home buyers. They don't speak English. They relied on their agent to guide them. And right now, we're trying to document that the buyer's agent actually had conversations and/or written, even better, communication with the buyer. Hey, you need to take a look at these things, because the buyer waived everything, and the house has lots of problems. He initially told us verbally, didn't tell me, told our agent verbally, no, that's okay, I've got relatives, they're contractors, we'll fix them. I think he got into the house, got estimates, and realized it's tens of thousands of dollars, doesn't have it, and is suing us for, are you ready for this? A couple of $1 million. Now, his claim is bogus at the high level of it. He's not going to get that because the house was only a $600,000 or $700,000 house. So about the most he's going to get is 600 or 700, and he's not going to get close to that. But he's got a pretty serious claim there. And again, my point being, we're being challenged right now to document that anything was done with this buyer other than putting a piece of paper under his nose, because that's what they're claiming. So review this with your buyer as well after the offer is accepted. You don't want to spend a lot of time getting the offer out there. You want to get it there because you're competing with others. I understand that. But then later you open up escrow. Now let's go back. Time to order investigations. We got a contingency window here. Let's get these things done and review all this with the buyer. And then you're pretty familiar with the form. It talks about the fact that you're recommending the buyer get these investigations. It itemized several of the investigations, including even the neighborhood conditions. So a good form. All right, number two, not obtaining the from a buyer's agent's perspective or not delivering from a seller's agent's perspective disclosures and inspection reports from a prior or previous sale. This is very, very important. We've had claims that when we dig into the claim, we discover there's all kinds of reports and disclosures that the buyer never got. Why? Because they were from a previous sale. So let's look at that in a little more detail. It's important for the agent to obtain or deliver, whichever side of the transaction you're on, inspection reports from and disclosures from previous or prior sales. So the most common one, and most of you are pretty good at this, is escrow canceled. Okay, well, we need that physical inspection that was done a month ago by the buyer who canceled. Usually the disclosures are going to be the same disclosures you got that the first transaction got. So there's probably no new disclosures there, but there may be inspection reports from that. So that's the most common one. What's not always addressed is the seller's acquisition of the property. Civil code and the paperwork says if you have disclosures and reports in your possession, they should be delivered. Now, the bad news is you probably have them in your possession because SkySlope goes back forever. I'm trying to negotiate with SkySlope to allow us to cancel transactions out of SkySlope. But right now, we can't do that. So you should inquire as to whether we represented this seller in the past. And if we did, then, go to SkySlope, Lindsay can help you, and get those reports, get those disclosures, and send them over. If we didn't represent the seller, we still need to inquire about that. And especially civil code requires that all documentation of a transaction be kept for 3 years. So if the current sale you're in, if that seller acquired the property 3 years or less prior to the sale, then the agent who represented them by civil code has that paperwork and should get that. Now, some sellers, if the seller's like Walt, he's got everything that he's ever, touched, any piece of paper that he's ever passed his desk is in a box somewhere in a storage room or a garage or somewhere. Mike made me get them out of the office, so they're not in the office so much. So I have that stuff. And so if you have a seller like that, you can tell the seller, look, if you got these things, you got to get them. As agents, I would not save disclosures and reports from more than, say, 4 years ago. Give yourself a window of cushion. Get rid of them, because if you've got them in boxes, you've got to procure them and get them out as well. So seller acquisition of property, get those reports. And that's especially important with flips. With flips, the guy bought it 3 months ago, and now he's selling it again, or she's selling it again. So whatever disclosures, reports that they got when they acquired the property, you need to ask for that and get those. Okay. Now, the way to deliver them is a receipt for reports. And the receipt for reports, most of you are familiar with it. It talks about, first of all, the buyer acknowledges getting these reports. We are not reviewing or verifying anything in these reports. And the buyer should do any investigations that these reports might reference. So that now you get to list all the different reports that you're handing the buyer. Now it's broken down to the paragraph 4 is reports and disclosures a part of this transaction. So paragraph 4 does not include a physical inspection report from a prior transaction. paragraph 5 lists reports from a previous transaction. And so you would list all of those. Now, in a cover email or even an addendum attached to the receipt for reports, the RFR, it is imperative to include this statement. And the statement is in your handout. So you want to, and I'm going to have this statement put in the agent hub so that you can always access it. So anytime you're providing disclosures or reports from a prior sale, you want to advise the client, whether you represent, no matter who you represent, the first two sentences are extremely important. The seller is providing the buyer the attached disclosure reports obtained by the seller when the seller acquired the property. Now, this is in bold because this is important. The information contained in these disclosures and reports may no longer be accurate. Now, I've talked to a lot of agents over the years about this, and of course, they're concerned, gee, this old report talks about, the roof leaks, and they put a new roof on. So do I need to give them that? Yes, because the buyer may want to investigate who put that roof on. So yes, you do. And the good news is you tell them, look, the information, the roof's leaking on this 4-year-old inspection report may no longer be accurate. Here's the not so obvious concern that I have. You have a 4-year-old report and it says the roof's just fine. But last year during a storm, half the shingles blew off. It's not fine today. So that's why this is in bold, not so much to, hey, we fixed all these things, but hey, just because these old reports say there's no problem, doesn't mean there might not be a problem now. And so that's very, very important. And then I put this in there. It's not a bad idea. If you have the buyer, this must be on there. If you have the seller, that's fine too. The buyer is advised to investigate the condition and suitability of all aspects of this property. So that's an important disclosure, a statement rather, to put with the disclosures and reports from a prior sale. Talks about additional investigations and the fact that reports prepared for the benefit of others may have limited liability. The preparer of those reports may have limited liability to the current user of the report who might be relying on them. So that's pointed out there. Okay. Number 3. Not carefully handling contingencies and contingency removals. I'm going to talk about something that's pretty common and can get you in a little bit of a pickle if you're not careful. And that is the very basic misunderstanding of an investigation contingency versus an inspection contingency. Folks, there is no inspection contingency in the RPA. There is an investigation contingency. No unique named inspection contingency or physical inspection contingency part of the contract. The inspection and physical inspection are part of the investigation contingency. So here's all the contingencies listed. Look for yourself. Notice nowhere does it say inspection. There's an investigation of the property, not an inspection of the property. Now, why am I harping on that? Because when you start talking about removing everything except the inspection contingency, you've removed everything. That's kind of like saying, I'm removing everything but the contingency on whether or not it rains in San Diego. Because I was told it never rains in San Diego. Well, guess what? That's not a contingency. And sometimes, not to get too carried away with this, but sometimes people use contingencies that they don't have to their detriment. We had a very, very nice buyer buy a high-end condo, and it was going to be their winter home. They were from the East Coast, and this is going back 15 years ago, and it's $1 million condo 15 years ago, probably $3 million today, I don't know. And they were going to liquidate some of their stock portfolio to pay this property all cash. Must be nice. Okay, good for them. All right. No sooner than their offer got accepted than the market took a 500-point dip. And they decided, this is a summer home, or winter home. We don't need it right now. And now is not a good time to liquidate. So they wrote this tremendously sweet email praising the seller, praising the listing agent, praying our agent, the buyer's agent, how wonderful everybody is. The house is just perfect. There's nothing wrong with the house. They were kind of felt guilty bailing. So they went overboard, basically saying there was no reason in the world for them not to buy the house, except the stock market has taken a 500-point dip. So now is not a good time to liquidate. They put that in an email to our agent, and our agent foolishly forwarded that email to the seller's agent. The seller sent a just as sweet email back. Thanks so much for letting us know right away. Thanks so much for all your compliments. However, the stock market is not a contingency of your purchase. So we will be keeping the $30,000 deposit. And believe me, tears were shed getting that resolved. So, somehow, thinking that there might be a contingency for something that's not listed here, there isn't one. So be mindful of how you identify contingencies. So an investigation contingency does in fact include, but it's not limited to, a general home inspection and other named and unnamed inspections. That's in paragraph 12B1 of the RPA. Waiving or removing the inspection contingency with the offer only removes, at best, and maybe not even, but at best, one could make the argument it removes a portion of the investigation contingency. It's equivalent to the contingency removal buyer, paragraph 2C2, and I've included that in your handout, and we'll look at it here in a minute. So here's where a general home inspection is listed as part of the buyer investigation, but it's not identified as a unique contingency in the contract. It is identified in the contingency removal, but if you were to remove, just the inspection contingency, I would argue that you're probably executing a removal of part of the investigation contingency, not all of it. And that is important to keep in mind. All right. Another common misidentified contingency is the so-called repair contingency. I've seen this all the time. Well, not all the time. I've seen it multiple times. The buyer removes all contingencies except the repair contingency. Removing the entire buyer's investigation contingency except repairs or repair contingency, they do that on CRB 2C4, effectively removes the entire buyer's investigation contingency. Why? Because there is no repair contingency. So I'm removing all of my investigation contingency except a contingency that doesn't exist. So think about that. You just remove all of the investigation contingency. So this is what I've seen. I've seen something like this, entire buyer's investigation except, and then they name something that is not in fact a contingency. If you write anything on this blank, make sure you can go back to paragraph 3 where the contingencies are listed and point to it, because those are the enumerated contingencies. The repairs or repair contingency isn't listed there as you saw a moment ago. So be very careful with that. The effect of removing contingencies. Okay, new subject about contingency removal. The effect of removing contingency before receiving disclosure and/or reports. It depends upon if the disclosures are statutory or other seller disclosures and documents. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at it. Receiving statutory disclosures after the buyer has removed contingencies effectively reinstates the contingencies. This is true only for statutory disclosures. The buyer has an irrevocable, unwaivable, absolute right of rescission for up to 3 to 5 days, depending on the method of delivery, 3 if in person, 5 if email or posted, after delivery of a statutory disclosure, to cancel if they don't like what's on the statutory disclosures. So removing contingencies and not receiving the statutory disclosures, the buyer still has those contingencies. They're irrevocable and unwaivable. So what are statutory disclosures? Well, most of you are familiar with most of them. The transfer disclosure statement, the TDS, and it includes the listing agent's AVID if the box is checked, and that's in section 3 of the TDS. So if the listing agent checked AVID, the box actually says AVID attached. It is not uncommon for the listing agent not to attach it. Shame on the listing agent. Hopefully it's not you, but you have not delivered the TDS until the AVID has also been delivered. Okay. The seller property questionnaire, as it turns out, has become a statutory disclosure. Why? Because it includes questions that are required. Statutory disclosures are in Civil Code 1102 and 1103, and the seller property questionnaire addresses several issues that are statutory disclosures listed in 1102 and 1103, and they don't appear on the transfer disclosure statement. They appear on the SPQ. So the SPQ is by practice now a statutory disclosure. Fire hardening and defensible space advisory and disclosure, the FHDS, that is the law requiring that to be provided, is part of Civil Code 1102 and 1103, and so it is also a statutory disclosure. The exempt seller disclosure, the ESD, that contains those questions on the SPQ that are statutory disclosure questions. So in a TDS exempt transaction, you still have to provide the exempt seller disclosure, not the TDS, and therefore not the SPQ. You would provide the ESD, and buyer has 3 to 5 days after the receipt of the ESD on TDS exempt transactions to cancel the transaction. The National Hazard Disclosure Report, and then finally the lead-based paint disclosure. So those 6 things, if they're delivered late, they reinstate, waived or removed contingencies. If the contingencies are going to be waived or removed with the purchase agreement, you want, as the listing agent, to be sure that these 6 things have been delivered to the buyer prior to them writing the offer, certainly prior to you accepting the offer. And then giving, if they send you the offer, then you send them these disclosures, then an email document they still want to proceed with that offer after having received the statutory disclosures. All right, the statutory disclosures are listed in paragraph 11. Won't go through that in any detail. It's in your handout so you can read them, and they are listed one after another. And then it talks about waiver being prohibited. You know, you can't waive these disclosures, and it talks about the termination rights once you receive these disclosures, and it's 3 days in person, 5 days delivered by mail, including email. Now here's the rub. Agents often get this mixed up. The delivery of non-statutory disclosures after the buyer removed the contingencies does not reinstate the contingency. So you haven't received the HOA documents yet, but you removed all contingencies. Now you get the HOA documents. You don't get them back. You don't get that HOA contingency back. So what you can do is not remove the contingency until you get the HOA document. And you're allowed to do that by contract. The contract requires that before the seller can compel you to remove a contingency, they have to fulfill their obligation. And the contract says they're obligated to give you HOA docs. So even though you might have a 10-day window and you don't have HOA docs yet, and on the 10th day, here comes a notice of buyer to perform, you can say, we're not removing these contingencies because you haven't delivered the HOA docs. And the contract says you have the contingency window, which would be the 10 days in my example, or 5 days after receiving disclosures the seller's supposed to give you, whichever's longer before you can be compelled to remove contingencies. So don't rush to remove contingencies on reports that you haven't received yet, because when you get those reports or disclosures, you won't get that contingency back. You know, buyers should not remove contingencies until the buyer has received all of the seller's other disclosures. It should be the other seller disclosures, not the other seller. Maybe the seller's other disclosures might be a better grammatical way how to construct that sentence. That's not on Lindsay, though. She typed what I wrote. That's my mistake. Okay, And that's on the CRB, by the way. It points out to the buyer, hey, you're removing some contingencies here. You might not get your deposit back if some of these things that you're removing are now problematic. Okay, so keep that in mind. Other disclosures that are not statutory include the preliminary title report, the HOA documents that I referenced, and the review of the leased or liened items. That's especially important today with solar panels. Okay, additional investigations the buyer should complete before removing investigation contingency is any recommended by the physical home inspection and the availability and cost of homeowners insurance. Okay, number 4, we're moving right along. I think we're going to be just fine. Allowing the seller to make repairs without a buyer contingency removal. That comes up all the time. So when you get the repair request, you should, at that time, because here's what happens sometimes. Buyers sometimes start making repairs even though nothing's been agreed to. Oh, I'm going to fix that stuff. I just start doing it. The paperwork's still back and forth. And then they spend money doing it because they want to be nice. And then the seller cancels. And then some of you who've been in real estate long enough, you will hear this sooner or later if you don't practice this. Who's going to pay me for these repairs I paid for? Well, guess what? The deposit's not available to you because the buyer did not remove contingencies. Whose fault is that? Probably the listing agent. So the listing agent should ensure that before the seller makes repairs, he either understands he's making these repairs at his expense because the buyer rather, is preserving their contingency rights and are refusing to remove certain contingencies, or he has every right to wait until those contingencies are removed before proceeding. Now, what comes up from time to time, and try to cover this quickly, removing a contingency does not remove the seller's obligation to perform. So every once in a while, I'll have a seller say, or a listing agent say to me, or the buyer, I'm sorry, have the buyer or the buyer's agent say to me, well, we don't want to remove contingencies because we haven't checked that the repairs were done. Well, if they've agreed to the repairs, you removing the contingency, you, the buyer, does not relieve the obligation of the buyer, of the seller, performing the repairs that the seller agreed to. And as you're going to see in a moment, contractually, the seller has to make the repairs appropriately. They have to be done right. So you don't need to say, well, I need to check to make sure the repairs are done right before I remove the contingency. No, you can remove the contingency once the seller agrees to making the repairs, and the contract protects you because the contract says the seller has to make sure the repairs are done right. So if that argument comes up and I lost you on this little explanation, give me a call, I'll walk you through it again. But waiting to remove contingencies until the repairs are done is not necessary. Okay. Now, so as a listing agent, you should ensure the buyer removes the investigation contingency or the contingency identified on a buyer contingency removal form attached to the request for repairs or to the seller's response, and the buyer replies for the request for repairs. So when the buyer makes their request for repairs, they have the ability to say, hey, we will remove the investigation contingency, that's the boilerplate, except, or they remove the contingencies identified on the attached CR as a part of their request to make the repairs. So you can provide a CR as a buyer's agent with your request. And you'll see in a moment that removal is only good if the request is ultimately agreed to by both parties. So you're not prematurely removing contingencies if you attach a contingency removal to your, as a buyer's agent's request. Because if the seller turns down your request, then that CR you provided is invalid. Okay, and you'll see that in a minute. I'll help you with that. Okay, now, if the seller's response, the seller to the buyer's request on the RR, the seller can respond by saying, we want you to remove certain contingencies, all of the contingencies identified on the CR. So you can add additional conditions to your response to the buyer's request. We're looking at the RR now. It's in your handout. Now, the buyer responds to the seller's, the buyer would then agree to what the seller is saying, yeah, you got to remove all the contingency, not just the investigation contingency. So if the buyer accepts that, then the buyer should also sign the contingency removal with all the contingencies. Now, seller's response to a buyer reply, if the seller's response is larger than what can be, on the RR, it has the same provisions. The seller can say, yeah, okay, we're going to do these things, but only if you remove either the identified contingencies here or all of the contingencies on an attached CR. As a practical matter, any contingency preserved gives the buyer the right to execute that contingency and get their deposit back. So as a practical matter, I would try as a listing agent to get all contingencies removed and check the appropriate box on the CR. That way, if the buyer doesn't buy the property and the seller has performed, the seller has the right to claim the deposit. Whether they succeed or not is another matter, but they would certainly, the deposit would be at risk to satisfying the seller's demand that they be compensated for the repairs that they made. Okay, so here's the buyer contingency removal, and we kind of, referenced it, and there's various boxes you can check. Removing certain contingencies or all of the contingencies. You can also remove all contingencies except. And again, if you list something in other, make sure what you put in this other blank is in fact an enumerated contingency in paragraph 3. Don't create a contingency, like I said earlier, like repair request. There's no such thing as that, as we've already covered, or removing all contingencies. Now, and again, here's the statement. Once the contingencies are removed, the buyer may not get them back. And then again, here's the note that if the repair request is a part of the RR or the RRRR, then the contingency removal is only valid if, in fact, there's an agreement between buyer and seller for these repairs. Number 5. Failing to advise the seller of the seller's responsibility if the seller agrees to make repairs, or failing to adequately confirm that the seller completed the repairs and obtained document, and that the buyer's agent obtains documentation that the seller by contract is obligated to provide. So that's on the RPA. The RPA talks about how repairs are to be done that are be done at, in compliance with building codes and civil code. So, if you don't say a licensed plumber and it's replacing a faucet, civil code doesn't require a person who replaces a faucet to be licensed. However, if the repair request includes, removing all of the plastic piping out of the house and replacing it with copper pipe, that's going to require a plumber's license. A handyman can't do it because the cost of that is going to exceed, I'm pretty sure the cost is still $600. So if the work exceeds $600 in cost, then a trade license must be held by the person doing the work according to civil code. Do sellers and homeowners violate civil code all the time? Yeah, that's known as the handyman. But if the handyman does work of more than $600, that's a violation of a code. So the buyer is somewhat protected that repairs must be done correctly and professionally. And then the seller must obtain invoices and paid receipts for repairs they hire somebody and provide copies of that. Or if they're doing the work themselves, prepare a written statement on what they did, the date they did it, and provide copies of invoices and paid receipts that they spent to do the repairs. So the seller has a pretty large bar to go over to follow the contract perfectly. There are some on this on this call. I don't want to single anybody out, but Sissy is phenomenal at making sure sellers perform to the RPA standard of repairs. And that is often done at the final verification of condition. She insists, and I'm sure she's very polite about it, but she takes care of her clients, and I'm sure others of you do the same thing. I just happen to have been involved in a few of the transactions where, I know that she did these sorts of things, and that is a good practice. Requiring copies of receipts and invoices and all of that to be provided at the verification point of the transaction. Okay, now the seller can also, the repair request paragraph 15, where the seller has to list all the things he did, that can be done on an SDAR form, seller statement of repair. Some of you are not members of SDAR. You don't have access to this form, so don't tell anybody we did this. But we put this on Agent Hub so that everybody in the contract company has access to this. And you can use it if you like. And so again, it restates basically what's in the repair clause of the RPA. And then the seller made the repairs, and here's the receipts, and here's the statement of what they did, or the repairs were made by others, and here's the receipts for the work and the names and phone numbers, or maybe contact information today would be the right phrase, of the person who did the repairs. Okay. And then finally, 6, real quickly, I want to just remind you of these forms. This won't be a class on these forms, but when these forms are appropriate and not part of the transaction, that can be very problematic. So the 3 forms I want to talk about briefly, or maybe 4 forms: the seller's purchase of replacement property, the SPRP, the tenant occupied purchase addendum, the so-called TOPA, and the seller in possession, or if appropriate, residential lease after sale, if the seller is going to remain in the property after close of escrow. So real briefly, the SPRP has 2 contingencies. This is important. One of them's boilerplate, and that's A. Now, A can be modified. That A is finding a replacement property, okay, and entering into a contract. A is not closing on the property. So if the seller's already found the property, then A doesn't apply, B does. And you would check B. Seller's already entered into a contract to acquire their replacement property, and you'd provide that information. As a seller's agent, as a listing agent, I would recommend you always check C, unless the buyer says, no, if this falls out, I still want to sell this home. I'll live with my in-laws until we find another home. Now, if the seller says that, great, then we don't need C check. Otherwise, close of escrow. I did a lot of cold calling when I was an agent, and I was a pretty successful listing agent. And a lot of times I would have sellers tell me, yeah, I'd sell my home, but only if I can get another home. They wouldn't say, only if I can close escrow on another home. But that's what they meant. If I can get another home, they meant close escrow. They never said, yeah, I'll sell my home, but only if I can enter into a contract to buy another home. So A is, like I said, the boilerplate. C is often the determining contingency. I mean, that's the important one for most sellers. That, yeah, I don't want to sell my house unless I have bought and closed escrow on another home. All right. Now, time period, that's important also to keep in mind. Time period, the boilerplate says time periods start when the buyer is notified you've entered into escrow. So if you check B, then the time frames will start immediately. But if you don't check B, then the time frames will only start when you deliver to the buyer the fact that you have entered into an escrow. Now, if you check this box, then the time frame stay per the RPA, which is probably immediate. You got 15 days to do your inspection. You got 17 days to get your loan, whatever. The reason you might be wanting to check this box in 2A is if you're going to buy the home contingent, the seller is going to buy a home contingent on successfully closing escrow on this home, and you haven't even had your physical inspection. Yeah, good news is, yeah, I got an offer. Yeah, I got an escrow. Bad news is, oh, no, we're not going to do the physical inspection until I identify a home that I've entered into contract with. Well, the seller of the home your seller is buying may not accept your COP offer because your sale is not far enough along. So it might be important for a listing agent to check this, recommend to the seller to check this box, so we can determine within the next 2 or 3 weeks that it looks pretty likely I can close escrow. Now it'll be easier to buy a home with a COP. Hope that makes sense. If not, call me. I'll walk you through it again. Same with the deposit. Okay. Seller's right to cancel, that's listed there too. Okay, let's talk about tenant occupied addendum real quickly, the TOPA. Here's the important thing I want to point out. The TOPA is created as a possession after close document. In other words, possession for the seller at the close of escrow while trying to avoid a rental agreement. Because the minute you create a rental agreement, now all of the rent laws, and those of you that are following rent laws, you know they're horrendous. The buyer suddenly becomes a landlord and the seller becomes a tenant, and suddenly the seller has all kinds of tenant rights, possibly because they've been identified as a tenant. So I'm ahead of myself. I'm sorry. I'm talking about an SIP. We'll have to edit this. Okay, let me go back to the TOPA. The TOPA is buying a tenant occupied property. If you accept an offer and a tenant is in the property, always use a TOPA, even if the tenant agrees to move out. Because if the tenant is in that property and doesn't move out, and you've agreed to sell that property vacant without a TOPA, the seller will be responsible for the costs of getting that tenant out and the cost to the buyer because the tenant wasn't out on time. So if there is anybody in the house who is not the seller, you should include a TOPA, even if the seller is going to sell the property vacant. All right. So the TOPA, the default of the TOPA is the tenants will remain in the property. By the way, anybody who's an adult person living in the property who's not the seller is by definition a tenant by law. And it doesn't matter whether they're paying rent or not. My adult son lives with me. He doesn't pay me rent. I don't want rent from my son. He's a tenant by law. Okay. So anybody who's an adult who doesn't have their name on that title is by law a tenant. Okay. So tenant to remain in possession, that's, most people think of the TOPA with this, but you use the TOPA even if you're going to deliver the property vacant because there is a tenant in the property now. He's going to move out tomorrow, but I'm executing this paperwork today. So check that box. Property to be delivered vacant. And then the seller makes a good faith estimate to get the tenant out and can't. Because you use the TOPA, the seller's liability to the buyer is only the cost of the physical inspection and the appraisal. Absent a TOPA, you sell the house, buyer to get possession, and you can't deliver possession, the seller could be liable for tens of thousands of dollars in damages. So this is very important. Use a TOPA if there's a tenant in the property, any adult not on title. Now, if the seller does remove the existing tenant, the seller has to tell the buyer how he got the tenants out. That's new to the TOPA, and that's because in some cases it might have been an ugly procedure, and this tenant may be pursuing action, including retaking possession of the property. So you got to advise the buyer that, yeah, this is how we got the tenant out. And then finally, the seller delivers within 5 days of escrow or whatever you put in the names of all adult occupants so that the buyer can be comfortable with allowing those occupants to remain in the property for whatever period of time has been agreed to. Okay. Now, I talked about the SIP. I got a little bit off the track there. I mentioned, I talked about the SIP at the beginning of the TOPA discussion. So real briefly, the SIP is intended for possession of 29 days or less. Why 29 days? Because there's some civil codes, some lawsuits where the courts have held any possession of 30 days or longer is in fact, a rental agreement, whether you got a rental agreement or not. So that's in the code. So Carr, in an attempt to avoid a rental agreement, was smart enough to say, well, let's not make this for 30 days or longer because there are some other things in the code that says any possession by anybody who doesn't own the property of 30 days or longer does in fact constitute a rental agreement. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't use the SIP for a 35-day seller possession. There might be a benefit to that. I'll talk about it in a minute. But you should inform the clients that this may well be determined to be a rental agreement, period, even though we don't talk about it. And here's the point. See, the seller does not pay rent. He remains in possession and uses the property after close of escrow. The buyer is identified as the buyer, not the landlord. The seller is identified as the seller, not the tenant. It's a short-term tenancy for 29 days. If it's longer, if 30 days or longer, they should, use the RLAS, and they should seek legal advice as to whether or not they are in fact creating a rental agreement. And of course, local rent control law may apply as well. No rent, it's license fee. No deposit, it's delivery of possession fee. So here's my point. In your conversations, especially written, don't refer, if you're using an SIP, don't refer to it as rent. Don't call it a rent back. It's not. It's a seller in possession agreement. It's a license fee. It's a delivery of possession fee. Because if there's documentation in the transaction that the agents are calling it rent and deposit, and then later one of the parties claims this is a rental agreement, not a seller in possession agreement, you're going to defeat that argument because all the documentation talks about rent and deposit. So don't use that language. Okay. Now, entry, if the seller's staying in the property, buyer can only enter the property to make repairs, agreed to repairs, or for emergencies, and then keys are delivered at close of escrow unless you check this box, delivered at the end of the SIP period. Okay, and then finally, I just want to show this to you. If it's 30 days or longer, it is in fact a rental agreement if you choose to use this form. And notice that the housing provider, that's the landlord, and the tenant, that's the pays the rent, and the seller is the tenant now. The buyer is the housing provider. By the way, the forms got rid of the word landlord. So that you won't find landlord in any of these forms now. It's housing provider. So they recognize that this is a rental agreement. And they talk about the term, and they talk about the payment, and it's rent, and it's security deposit, all that sort of thing. Okay? Whew. I think we ran a couple minutes over, but just only a couple minutes, started a couple minutes late. So that completes what I have to share with you. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Yeah, so Jim Supples wants to know, do they need to sign a waiver if they receive one or more reports from a previous transaction or pre-inspection?
Yes. If the buyer did not hire, great question, Jim. If the buyer did not hire their own physical inspection, then they are waiving themselves purchasing, procuring, getting a professional home inspection. So they're relying on the inspection report that was done a week ago. They are waiving their right to an inspection.
How many years back should we go if we represent the seller as the listing agent for previous inspections when they purchased the home as the buyer?
The law is pretty clear, and the SBQ says the same thing. Anything in your possession. So now, where you want to talk about how many years do I need to go back, you have the legal right to destroy residential, real estate, or even commercial. You have the right to destroy real estate paperwork that is more than 4 years old. Statute of limitations on purchase agreement where you are not, you're not part of the contract. In other words, buyer's agent, seller's agent, you're not the principal. The statute of limitations for you is 3 years, unless they can allege fraud. So they can go back up to 3 years and sue you for something in the RPA. If you have a contract, in other words, you listed the buyer, you have a buyer representation agreement or a listing agreement, statute of limitations is 4 years. So in the past, when we destroyed paper records, we erred on the conservative side. I think we went 5 years. So 5 years, which covered something from 4 years and a day to 4 years and 365 days, and that got us past the 4-year window. So a long explanation, but it's an incorrect question to say how long do I have when I don't have to give disclosures or reports that I have in my possession? You have to give them. The SIP does not put a time limit on it. It says all. The SIP says seller is delivering all the reports that they have in their possession. So I made a little joke. If it's me, I've got reports probably going back 10, 12 years. You know, I bought my house that I'm living in now in 2006. I guarantee I had that physical inspection somewhere. Yeah, but so I got to give it. If I either got to clean my house up and throw that away first before I put my house on the market, or if I don't, then I ideally I should find it and deliver it. Unfortunately, SkySlope does not have in their function the ability to delete records, and that's a good thing. Except, I've talked to them and it's a little bit problematic. They're having a hard time because how do they put controls on somebody inappropriately deleting records? But I believe, as many attorneys advise me, not all, by the way, but many attorneys have told me you should destroy records 5 years or older. You shouldn't have them. I've had a few attorneys say, no. Sometimes it'd be helpful that you have the record. Well, that's true if you did everything right. If you didn't do something right, and having that record could hurt you. I hope that answered the question. It's not how long, it's do you have it or not?
Who's responsible for filling out the TOPA, the listing agent or the buyer's agent?
Well, either party could do it. I would argue it's, because the TOPA, the principal benefit of the TOPA, it's not the only benefit, but the most important benefit that I see is limiting the seller's liability to a buyer who is buying a home they intend to move in, and they've been told that the tenant will be out. So they're buying it buyer occupied, their loan is buyer occupied, and there's some kind of an agreement that the tenant will be out at close of escrow. Well, guess what? You're not the boss of the tenant, So if the tenant's a good person and they move out like they said they would, yay, everybody's happy. I don't hear the good stories. I'm sure a lot of them do. Nobody calls me up and says, Walt, I have these tenants. They're wonderful. They do everything they're supposed to do. I just thought you should know that. I don't get those calls. I do get, Walt, I have this tenant, and it's a tenant from hell. And he tells me all the things that are bad. So I have a sort of a prejudicial feeling about tenants only because those are the people, the bad ones, that I deal with all the time. A tenant who intends to get out, but then finds it not so easy to find a rental property and is now delaying getting out. And we've had many, oh yeah, now I'm going to get out, but it's going to take me an extra 2 weeks. And the buyer is saying, wait, I need to move in. And if you don't get this tenant out, I'm going to sue you for damages. Oh, no, sorry. The TOPA says only the physical inspection and the appraisal cost. That's all I'm liable for.
Is it legal to use the SIP if over 29 days license fee?
Well, see, again, is it legal? The SIP is not a form couched in legal terms. The TDS is legal. TDS is, in fact, the form of the TDS is in civil code. I can print out 1103 or 1102.3 or something, and the TDS is right there. It doesn't have CAR's little symbol on it, but it's got all the boxes and everything. And so the SIP is not a, quote, legally recognized document. It's a contractually recognized document. The purpose of the SIP was to try to create the situation where you're staying in the property for 2 weeks and the buyer and the tenant, the buyer and the seller don't want to get mucked up in rental law. So the SIP is an attempt by CAR to say this is not a tenant, this is not a landlord, this is a buyer and a seller agreeing to give the seller possession for an extra 2 weeks. I can tell you that has not been tested in court yet. This could go to court. An SIP could go to court. The seller could say, I am a tenant and I have rights. And the buyer, who's my landlord, my housing provider, is not giving me those rights, and I'm suing for it. And the court could say, agents, CAR, I don't care what you call this. This is a rental agreement. Now, here's why it's less than 30 days. They will probably for sure say it's a rental agreement, because elsewhere in the civil code it says any possession agreement, any agreement that allows somebody to take possession of a property that they don't own for 30 days or longer is by default a rental agreement. Now that's in the code, that's in case law. So car being, car legal being as wise as they are, and they are very wise, by the way, they know. They said, look, we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot from the get-go. We're not going to make an SIP for as long as you want. We're going to keep it 29 or less so we can argue this is not a rental agreement. If it's 31 days, can you still use the form? Yes. But you might find out you had a rental agreement there, whether you knew it or not, because it's longer than it's 30 days or longer. The thing I didn't cover, I got skipped right over it. I apologize for doing that because that's important. The benefit of the SIP to a buyer is the seller maintains the property in the condition it was as modified by any agreed to repairs when the offer was written. Twice we've been involved in hot water heaters going out after close of escrow, and the seller who lived in the property at the time not being responsible for that. So if anything happens to a property after close of escrow and there's a rental agreement, guess what? The faucet starts to drip. Tenants don't replace faucets, even if it only costs $50. Landlords do. Landlord's responsibility to have a functioning toilet, functioning faucet, functioning heater. That's in the law. So a rental agreement puts a lot of responsibility on the buyer after close of escrow. The SIP shifts that back to the seller. If this heater goes out 2 weeks after close of escrow, seller is responsible for repairing it if there's an SIP. If it's a rental agreement or absent an SIP, the buyer is responsible for it. You're going to move into a house now and the heater didn't work, and the buyers, and we've been there. The buyer claims the seller broke it. Seller says, I didn't break it. And too bad, buyer, even if, you are now the landlord. An SIP sort of changes that a little bit, or attempts to. Hope that's clear.
That's all the questions in the chat, but I noticed, Sarah, did you have a question?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. You were just unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Well,
All right. Well, thank you, Lindsay. Thanks all of you for being a part of the class today. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Have a great rest of the day. And hopefully the Aztecs will do good on the next ball game.
thank you, Walt.
Take
Thank
care.
you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.